That was how Stacy had heard about me, and I her. Anyway, Stacy went on to tell me that Raina's relationship with her girlfriend Tony was extremely rocky, or as she put it, drop-dead hella intense. This didn't surprise me, although I didn't say so. You live the way you play. I would say that each love has a moment when it makes the mark on your poetic consciousness, when it rearranges the way you see both the love itself and through it your entire life. For me, that mark was made the next July when Raina and I and 100 other recruits headed off to a nearby college to attend Blue Star. In theory, Blue Star was a basketball camp, an instructional week, but in truth it was a glorified meat market. And it would become more so in the next few years as the popularity of women's basketball grew. That summer, 200 or 300 vultures from colleges all over the country sat perched on one side of the stands and watched us, the main attraction, numbered and thrown out into the court like performing animals. Blue Star was big business, invitation only. We got free basketball shoes from Converse and a navy and red camp t-shirt that would unravel from after the first time we washed it. Although we were all under great pressure to perform well and raise our stock with the scouts, the most important event of that week, for me, had nothing to do with basketball. On the second to last evening after our afternoon games, Raina enlisted me to scoot back up to the dorms with her to beat the crowd for dinner. It was 7 o'clock by then and still light outside, although the sun was low and muted. We took a shortcut and started through what looked like a little patch of woods, but after the initial clump of trees, we stumbled into a clearing that wasn't visible from the road. "Holy shit," said Raina softly, and I knew that all plans to be early for dinner were out the window. She walked off toward the little pond that was tucked into a corner of the clearing. Green and yellow stalks were shooting out of the water, and a few ducks were sat communicating in the middle. All the greenery was darker than it might have been in broad daylight, as if the moisture from the insides of things had been pushed out to the surface, so that everything assumed a richer color. I followed Raina from maybe 20 feet behind, watching her steps get smaller as she got closer to the edge of the water. The grass extended halfway up her legs, and her thin shoulders rolled back as she turned her head to look at something. "Nancy," she said without turning, "come here." I worked my way towards her through the long yellow grass. A few feet in front of us was a bunch of ducklings, little brown balls of feather and fur. They were waddling around, bumping into each other, peeping, falling down. I turned to look at Raina as she was staring at them, eyes bright as if lit from within. I felt suddenly that I was intruding on something, and backed away. She didn't seem to notice. She just kept standing in the grass, motionless, as I stood there watching Raina watch the ducklings. It just hit me. Boom. I couldn't have explained what it was that moved me so much. All I knew was that the sight of Raina absorbed in something, oblivious to me and to everything else, touched off such a tangled surge of imagination, pain, and desire that I had to take a few steps away from her to keep from falling over. It was as if something had cracked in me, had opened up, suddenly, into some other place I knew nothing about. So it was ironic, to say the least, when my father leaned forward at Summer League the next week and asked about the gorgeous, straight-backed woman sitting in front of us in the bleachers. A few weeks later, he asked Raina's mother out for dinner, and Claudia blinked a few times and said yes. I figured they'd go out once or twice, maybe, and that would be it. It wasn't. Even after it became clear, though, that there was really something going on between them, it took a while to register with me. Part of it was that my dad had dated several women since my mother left when I was 6, and I had learned not to have expectations. Also, I rarely saw them together. They tended not to spend much time at our place. And of course, it was just too strange to consider the fact that my father was dating the mother of the girl that I liked. My father, Wendell, like me, was large. 23 years before, he'd been the only Asian named to the All-State High School football team, at linebacker. He got his optimism and sense of humor from his father, who was a shopkeeper before his internment during World War II, and a gardener after it. His size came from his unusually tall mother, and also from consuming, as he put it, lots of meat. Now he was a math teacher and assistant football coach at a high school a few miles from our house. My father was a popular teacher. Kids came to talk to him about their problems, and he gave his players rough bear hugs when they were doing something good on the field. He was the kind of cheerfully macho big man who could get away with crying, which he did every year at his football banquet and at home during 8 is Enough. He was thrilled to have an athlete for a daughter. The first time I beat him at one-on-one, the summer I turned 12, he slapped me on the back and gave me a beer and moaned about getting old. Claudia said he was adorable. I didn't know about that, but when I looked at other people's fathers, or at least the few who were around, I knew that I was luckier than most. I finally realized that his relationship with Claudia was serious when it occurred to me that he was almost never home. Normally, even when he was seeing someone, he wouldn't take her out very often. He blamed finances, claiming that it was too expensive to pay for a babysitter, and then dinner for two. Instead, he'd invited the women over, cooked dinner for her, and then all three of us would watch a rented movie. Occasionally, the women would spend the night, and my father would look embarrassed in the morning. He'd never stay over at her place. The women would eventually get tired of this arrangement, accusing my father of being cheap, antisocial, or completely unromantic. I didn't think that was accurate or fair. The truth was he didn't want to leave me. I'd been his main companion since my parents got divorced, his sidekick, his second in command. When I was younger, we'd watch cartoons together, usually Bugs Bunny or the Roadrunner, and if I left and went to a friend's house, he would watch them by himself. After I beat him at basketball, though, he started taking me to bars. We'd go to Gardenia, a Japanese-American town where it didn't matter that I was almost a decade from legal, because the bartenders were always friends. My father believed in the redemptive power of heartfelt talks with strangers. He taught me always to tip the bartender well and never to drink cheap beer. After he met Claudia, though, he started going out more and leaving me at home by myself. From the way he'd behaved with past women, I expected him to make a big production out of presenting her to me. But he didn't. He was too far gone to care. He and Claudia went out to movies and dinner and basketball games, and even spent the night at her apartment. I'd never been jealous of my father's girlfriends. His priorities had always been obvious, and I wasn't jealous of Claudia either, but for an entirely different reason. I was 16 by the time he met her, old enough to drive, and it was easier to have my own social life when my father wasn't around. With his attention taken up by Claudia, I could stay out later, have friends over, spend more time alone. Sometimes, though, he'd still go through the motions of asserting parental control. "You are grounded," he'd say after I broke some household rule. Then he would leave for the weekend. Raina didn't seem too rattled by our parents' relationship either. We ran into each other at college games and high school tournaments throughout the fall and winter of our junior year. But we didn't often refer to our parents' romance and only acknowledged that it existed when one of us asked the other to give the corresponding parent a message. "Ask my dad to pick up some cereal on the way home tomorrow," I'd say. Or, "Tell him his friend Kenneth called." The novelty of it, the irony, soon wore off for both of us, and the relationship faded quickly into everyday life. There was something I noticed about the way children of divorce dealt with their parents' post-marital love lies. We never get our hopes up about anyone new, but on the other hand, we were never surprised. They moved in on the third Sunday of August 1986. Although my father and Claudia had taken Raina and me out to dinner a month before to tell us this was happening, I didn't really believe it until they showed up that morning with a U-Haul full of their stuff. I was both annoyed and thrilled about the move, drunk with the idea of seeing Raina more often, but unhappy about sharing the house. I had no idea what Raina thought. She didn't talk much to me or anyone else. When I'd seen her at parties, there'd always been people around her, but they kept a respectful distance. I intended to do the same, as much as possible. Raina seemed poised, mature, in control of herself, completely out of my league. The day they moved in, Raina and I helped bring boxes in from the truck where our yellow lab, Anne, after Ann Myers, the first woman to try out for the NBA team, stood ears up on the driveway supervising. Occasionally, a neighbor would stop by to help and look at Claudia and Raina curiously, interested in the spectacle of two black women moving into a Japanese household. There were a couple of people, too, not people we were close to, who glared at my father disapprovingly, but they were the same ones who had always looked at us with vague suspicion and disapproval, as I tried not to pay them any mind. My more immediate concern after I accepted that they were staying was that Claudia and Raina thought of the house. It had always looked to me like a huge cardboard box. It was exactly the right color, and the crumbling stucco gave it a rough, unfinished feel. The garage faced the front, but we didn't use it for the car because the door was cracked so dramatically, the fissures running from ground to roof that you couldn't lift it without breaking into pieces. Our driveway was a network of small, interwoven cracks, like a flat expanse of bone-dry earth. The two shrubs by the front door reached up toward the sun half-heartedly, as if uncertain they wanted to grow. Claudia watched all the moving activity from the chair my father had set up for her on the scraggly front lawn. He told her to take it easy, although she was muscular and fit and could probably have lifted as much as we jock types. "No problem at all," he gasped from under a large box. He was still trying hard to impress her. Our place was big for that section of Inglewood, 2 stories and 3 bedrooms, one of which my father used as a study. It had been cheap when he bought it in the mid-'70s, a time when, as its first owner, a white man, had put it, the neighborhood was starting to turn. We moved there right after my parents divorced because he wanted to escape the white suburb where my mother had insisted we live, a place that I too had hated because the kids there hated me, and go back to a place more familiar to him, more like the racially mixed working-class neighborhood in Watts, where he'd grown up in the 50s and 60s. My mother had stayed behind in Rolando Beach, eventually marrying a white lawyer whose bully son had beaten me up on a regular basis. She was horrified by my father's choice of neighborhood. Inglewood, when we moved there, was already quite poor, but things had gotten worse in the next 10 years after the economic benefits that Reagan had promised, instead of trickling down, trickled out. At first, our neighborhood had also been more mixed, but gradually the whites, Asians, and Latinos moved down to the other places, leaving a bunch of black families and us. I didn't sleep much the week that Claudia and Reina moved in. At night, I lay rigid, eyes open, pondering the facts that there were 2 more people in the house, and that Reina was just on the other side of the wall. Daytime was awkward. We were all overly conscious of each other and careful, especially my father, who ran around the house like a mad scientist tending to his wildest experiment. Reina, meanwhile, was friendly to my father and me, but distant, as if she were a temporary guest who had to be tolerant of us because we were putting up with her for the night. My father didn't seem to notice because he had his hands full with Claudia. She often worked late at her job in the circulation department of the Los Angeles Times, but when she was home, he floated around, grinning as if he couldn't believe she was gracing our house with her royal presence. He'd bring her roses he'd bought from stoplight vendors and serve her breakfast in bed in the morning. She indulged his behavior patiently, but she was obviously flattered. "I can't remember the last time a man spoiled me this way," she said. "I'm sure it won't last for long." Okay, I'm going to stop here. But I really encourage you to read the book if you have a chance.
Judy and Georgina, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming and staying.
Thank you for staying. That's great.
And thanks to all of you for coming out and sharing this hour with us. We've got one more program next week, and if you're free, we'd love to have you join us again. So thanks again, and thanks to our readers.
Thank you.